So Rachel, I think we can start now.
Great. Well, welcome everyone to this Girls Not Brides sponsored Google Hangout together with the Council on Foreign Relations and the International Women's Health Coalition. I'm Rachel Vogelstein, Fellow for Women and Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of a new report called Ending Child Marriage: How Elevating the Status of Girls Advances U.S. Foreign Policy Objectives. I'm so pleased to be joined by Lakshmi Sundaram, the Global Coordinator for Girls Not Brides, the Global Partnership to End Child Marriage, and Jennifer Redner, the Senior Program Officer at the International Women's Health Coalition. Welcome, everyone. We encourage you to submit questions and comments during this Google Hangout, and we'll start with a question from Lakshmi.
So Rachel, I was really excited when I first heard that you were going to be writing this report, mainly because child marriage hasn't typically been regarded as a foreign policy issue. It's been seen as a development issue because it has such a big impact on girls' health, on their education, and on their overall development. But why is it that the Council on Foreign Relations decided to put together this report, and why in this report do you argue that actually it's not just a development issue, it should also be looked at through the lens of its links with foreign policy objectives?
That's a great question, and there are kind of three reasons why the Council took on this issue. The first issue is that child marriage is really far more prevalent than most people realize. The number of women married as children is really staggering. The UN estimates that 1 in 3 women aged 20 to 24, so approximately 70 million women, were married under the age of 18, and nearly 5 million girls are actually married under the age of 15 every year, or about 13,000 per day. And we know that some girls are actually married as young as 8 or 9 years old. So the size of the problem is really staggering, and the practice occurs across regions, across cultures and religions. We know that India accounts for approximately 40% of the world's known child brides, but this tradition is pervasive elsewhere in South Asia, across sub-Saharan Africa, and also in parts of Latin America and the Middle East. So the first reason we really took this on was to make folks aware of the scope and the size of this problem. The second reason we've taken on this issue is to make the case that ending child marriage is not just a moral imperative, but really a strategic imperative, because it has broad implications for U.S. foreign policy goals, including development, prosperity, and stability. And I can give you a few examples. Consider, for example, the area of economic growth. We know that research suggests that child marriage often curtails education for young girls, which not only undercuts their potential, but also stifles economic progress. So even 1 extra year of schooling beyond average has been shown to increase women's wages by 10 to 20%. And a World Bank study actually suggests that increasing the share of women with a secondary education raises a country's annual per capita income growth. So these benefits that we see when girls are educated, when they stay in school, vanish when their educations are cut short by marriage. The report also points to new research that girls are actually more likely to become single mothers through divorce, abandonment, or widowhood than by having children out of wedlock, which I think is counter to a lot of the perceptions. And so really that creates a cycle of poverty, an intergenerational cycle of poverty that becomes very difficult to break. We also talk in the report about stability. You know, recent research suggests that child marriage is associated with instability. There's actually one analysis that shows that of the 25 countries with the highest prevalence of child marriage, most are either fragile states or at risk of natural disaster. And we see reports from war-torn states like Syria or Afghanistan, or drought-stricken countries like Niger, that confirm that families are pursuing this strategy in times of crisis or conflict in an attempt to preserve resources. But really, perpetuation of this practice only exacerbates poverty, illiteracy, poor health, and ultimately instability in places that are already overwhelmed by complex challenges. The third thing to know about child marriage and why it matters to U.S. foreign policy is that our U.S. Congress has actually recently enacted a law that elevates this issue and requires the U.S. Secretary of State to develop a strategy to address the international scourge of child marriage. So this is a moment where in the U.S. government we really have an opportunity to capitalize on a lot of the new policies that have been put into place and really bring our resources to bear to address this issue in a serious way.
Yeah, this really makes me start thinking of the story of Dum Dum, who is based in the extreme north of Cameroon, which is an area where you see extremely high rates of child marriage occurring. And she came home from school one day at the age of 15, and her bags were packed for her, and she was told that she'd be leaving to go and marry a man much, much older than her. And when she did, she quickly became pregnant, as young girls often do, married to much older men. And at 15 years old and 8 months pregnant, she escaped the marriage and fled and went home to her family. And her family was ashamed that she left and asked, what are we supposed to do now with you? And she thought about ending her life, to the point where she was looking at ways in which to do that. And the ways in which she thought to do that was to crush glass and swallow it. And before she did that, she thought about what she would be telling God. And she thought to herself, what, are we all supposed to do? Are we all supposed to die? And so I think about stories like Dum Dum, who is just one of millions of stories out there. And I think that in and of itself is the moral imperative for the U.S. government to be doing more on this issue. But beyond the moral imperative of the human rights violations that they endure, the many reasons and many, many more than was just articulated, it's a smart thing to do, to be investing in this issue, because frankly, we will not be able to achieve any development objectives unless we prioritize putting women and girls' health and human rights at the center. And only by ending child marriage will we be able to do so. And so really thrilled that the United States has recognized that this is not only a moral imperative, but a foreign policy imperative. And I know that other governments are starting to recognize that. And so Lakshmi, could you talk a little bit about other governments who have begun to make this a foreign policy priority as well as the U.S.?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Jen. To be frank, the issue of child marriage hasn't traditionally been a foreign policy priority for any government. The needs and rights of adolescent girls, as Jen mentioned, have quite largely been ignored on an international setting. And, to be honest, this is reflected in the lack of progress on a number of important indicators. So as both of you have said, there is a moral imperative, and governments should really be addressing these issues because it's the right thing to do. What's been interesting is that in the last couple of years there's been an increasing body of evidence linking child marriage with a number of other indicators related to health, education, prosperity, as has been mentioned before. And a number of governments, including, for instance, the United Kingdom, have started to really start taking on the issue of child marriage within some of the work that they're doing. But, for a lot of people, these issues are still considered soft. I'm sorry to say that, and sort of nice to have, which is why the CFR report is really important, because it highlights not only that child marriage hinders so many of these so-called soft goals, but also ones that many governments would consider to be hard goals or serious goals. And so that's why I think it is actually really important for other governments to take a look at this report, to think about how it also applies to their own foreign policy objectives, and perhaps conduct a similar analysis to how child marriage links to some of the other things that they're trying to achieve through their foreign policy offices. But it's not just a question of foreign policy. In countries where the prevalence of child marriage is high, there's a real imperative as well to address this issue as something that hinders achievement of domestic policy. And again, I think the report starts really sort of crystallizes how you can start talking about the relationship between child marriage and some of these other, whether they're domestic policies or foreign policies, that we've traditionally thought of as being hard. And I think so. So I think it's important to, as we build on this report, to really start working with other governments as well to really help show the link between what they're trying to do and the issue of child marriage.
I think that's a really great point. You know, we had an event here at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington this week to help unveil our new report on child marriage, and we were fortunate to host the Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, Don Steinberg, and he's someone who sits in, you know, high-level meetings at the White House every week talking about what are considered to be the quote-unquote hard foreign policy issues. And he went out of his way to note at the event that we had this week that the line between hard, quote, hard foreign policy issues and, quote, soft foreign policy issues has really blurred. I mean, there are meetings where folks are sitting around talking about stability in a place like Afghanistan, and these issues are on the table. I think that is really instructive as we collectively think through what our policy priorities might look like, that these issues no longer can be relegated to the sideline. And the main reason for that is really the evidence. I mean, the report goes into great detail about the volume of evidence we have at this point that demonstrates how the practice of child marriage undermines a range of foreign policy priorities. Get back to the issue, for example, of stability. There are laws around the world that set the minimum age of marriage. There are actually only 4 countries in the world, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Gambia, and Equatorial Guinea, that have no law whatsoever. So pretty much everywhere else there's at least some law. And yet we know just from the sheer numbers, 14 million women under the age of 18 married every year, that these laws are being ignored. And in some places where governments attempt to enforce these laws, we've even seen violence in terms of resistance to enforcement of the laws. And all of that is incredibly corrosive to the rule of law, which has broad implications, and that goes, again, to overall stability. Take another issue like global health. We know that early marriage begets early pregnancy and childbearing, which is the leading cause of death for girls aged 15 to 19 in the developing world. And even where young mothers do survive, the health of their children is jeopardized. Stillbirths and infant mortality are 50% more likely when mothers are under the age of 20, and the risks of prematurity, low birth weight, and childhood malnutrition increase as well. These poor health outcomes matter to overall well-being, to stability, and to objectives, policy objectives to the U.S., but also to countries around the world.
And Rachel, if the U.S. government is to make child marriage a foreign policy priority, what does that mean in practical terms? What steps should the U.S. government be taking to make sure that they take on some of the considerations from this report?
It's a great question, and the report actually has an entire section that includes recommendations for the U.S. government, and there are 4 key recommendations that I want to highlight today. The first is that we recommend that the issue of child marriage is elevated in our diplomacy, and there are a number of ways that the U.S. can do this. The first is in traditional bilateral interactions. We have, for example, strategic dialogues with certain countries, including India, which has, as mentioned before, an incredibly grave problem of child marriage. Child marriage should be elevated in a strategic dialogue with a country like India and in our other bilateral discussions. We also can join with partners around the world who are working on this issue. The UK has already been mentioned, the Canadians, the Norwegians, the Australians. There are a lot of folks who are already working on this issue, and we can really leverage each other's efforts on the ground. We've also suggested the possibility of creating a new report similar to the Trafficking in Persons report that would really highlight what countries, what governments are doing to address this problem, or what they're not doing and could and should be doing. And then finally, we specifically reference the post-Millennium Development Goal conversation that's going on right now, and encourage the United States to make sure that child marriage is included, potentially as an indicator, for example, of the overall well-being of adolescent girls and also the overall status of women. So those are some of the ways that the U.S. could take a leadership role in its diplomacy. We also, as a second recommendation, suggest that the U.S. increase funding for this issue. And specifically, we recommend an interagency process be put into place to ensure that the funds that we already have going to a range of issues that are affected by the practice of child marriage, like global health, like economic growth, like education, the rule of law, that all of these accounts have a robust component that focuses on this issue because of its importance to the outcomes that we seek in each of those areas. In addition to increasing funding, as a third recommendation, we also recommend that our resources be targeted in a systematic way. And there are three areas that we highlight in particular. The first is that we should look carefully at the area of maternal and child health. And the reason for that is because of the evidence showing a strong link between early marriage and early pregnancy and childbearing, and how that contributes to maternal and child mortality. The second area we highlight is family planning. And the reason for that is because of the sheer number of girls who are already married and have an unmet need for family planning. The Population Council has done some really interesting work that shows an overlap in areas where you have unmet need for family planning and large numbers of girls who already are married or who are at risk of being married. We should really be targeting our resources there. And the third area that we highlight in particular is girls' secondary education, because of the clear evidence of the relationship between girls' enrollment in secondary school and age at marriage. And that's an area where the U.S. really could amplify its efforts and make sure that of the education resources that we do have, that we have a substantial portion going to girls' secondary education. We also recommend that we target our resources in countries, and a few criteria are outlined in the report. The first is that we look at the cross-cut of population and prevalence of child marriage. And when you do that, countries like India that have enormous numbers of young girls and a high prevalence rate rise to the top of the list. We also recommend looking carefully at countries that have high prevalence rates of child marriage for girls under the age of 15. Places like Niger, Bangladesh, countries in West Africa. We should really make sure that we're focused on this issue in those regions. The third criteria that we mention is political will. There are some countries that are taking on this issue internally, and Ethiopia is an example of a country that has created a national action plan on harmful traditional practices that includes the practice of child marriage. We should make sure we're capitalizing on places where there already is political will to address this issue. The next criteria we mention is strategic interests. There are places like Afghanistan, like Yemen, South Sudan, that are of importance to the United States, and we should make sure that we're addressing this issue when we think about stability in those places. The final issue we mention is gaps. There are some areas where we know this practice exists from the numbers, and yet we know very little information about it. Latin America, for example. We need to know more, we need to be doing more. So targeting our resources carefully is another recommendation. The final recommendation we make is that we need to strengthen our monitoring and evaluation of this practice. Internally, the U.S. government should really be tracking its expenditures on child marriage in the different sectors that we've talked about: health, education, economic growth, the rule of law. And also, we need to know more about the rate of child marriage in diaspora and immigrant communities in the United States. Externally, there's still a lot of missing information. We know very little, for example, about prevalence in about half of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa region. We should be promoting more data collection in those areas. So those are just some of the recommendations that the report makes, and I hope that our government will incorporate as it begins to develop a new strategy to combat the international scourge of child marriage.
That's great, Rachel. That's a really great summary of the report, and it couldn't have come at a more timely moment, and really appreciate the Council on Foreign Relations taking on this important issue and having such concrete recommendations and next steps that the administration can and should take. As you rightly mentioned, with the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, the U.S. now has a legislative mandate requirement to produce a multi-sectoral and multi-year strategy to combat child marriage. And one of the critical elements of the strategy is the fact that it's called multisectoral, or requires, an analysis of the ways in which different sectors like education, health, economic empowerment, violence prevention, etc., feed into this effort to end child marriage. Because only by investing in a range of interventions will we be able to meet the holistic needs of girls, not only to prevent child marriage, but to support the already tens of millions of girls that find themselves married as children. I think about programs like Berhane Hewan, which was established by the UNFPA, UN Population Fund, Nike Foundation, and the Population Council, which is a tremendous example in Ethiopia about how concerted action with the local community can result in change. We also want to make sure that the U.S. is investing in local indigenous organizations. These are young women, often who have already been child brides, who know they want to leave that marriage or have already left the marriage. The story of Dam Dam, is just one example of that. We recently saw the story of Maresa Kilusu from Tanzania, who was 13 years old and forced to marry a 70-year-old. She, of course, now finds herself to be 29 years old with 5 children, but was able to leave her husband and be welcomed back by her mother after many, many years. So we need to make sure that the programs that the U.S. government invests in to end this practice are really community-based and take in the local needs and the local context, that it reaches the world's most vulnerable girls. These girls at risk for early marriage or already married are the world's most vulnerable girls, often the most hardest to reach. And so, as you rightly pointed out, Rachel, there has to be a very rigorous analysis that the U.S. government undertakes in order to assess where to invest and how to invest. And as co-chair of Girls Not Brides USA, the International Women's Health Coalition has been working with our partners to increase the status of this issue among the U.S. government agencies. And we're really looking forward to working with them to develop this comprehensive strategy, because really the time has come. And more governments are recognizing that addressing child marriage is absolutely fundamental to achieving development objectives. And the U.S. is one donor country. There are others, but there's also national governments who are recognizing that this is a problem and that it must be addressed. So the role that the U.S. can play as both a leader and partner with national governments and other donor governments cannot be underestimated in terms of that power. And so the next steps that the U.S. government will take will be absolutely instrumental in ensuring that we don't lose the momentum out there that currently exists all over the world to end this practice. And while the U.S. government is already investing billions of dollars in the programs that Rachel described, such as poverty reduction, education, health, etc., there's a burgeoning interest and understanding that by integrating that issue of preventing child marriage or supporting married adolescents in those programs in countries like Yemen, in countries like Ethiopia, India, unfortunately there's so many that need our attention, but by undergoing that analysis that Rachel described and by investing in local organizations, the U.S. can be that catalyst and can be part of that tipping point that's needed to end this practice worldwide. So Lakshmi, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the work that's being done globally. I've talked a little bit about the work of Girls Not Brides USA, putting this issue on the U.S. foreign policy agenda, and the Council on Foreign Relations report also goes a very long way for elevating attention to this important issue. Can you talk a little bit more about other members beyond Girls Not Brides USA and what they're doing at the grassroots and community level to realize the change that they seek in their own communities and countries?
Thanks, Jen. So that was a really interesting comment that you made, Jen, about the need for the U.S. government to work through local organizations that actually really are living in the communities where child marriage is taking place and really understand what's going on and how to address the practice at that level. I mean, you asked, what are Girls Not Brides members doing? What are Girls Not Brides members not doing?
Good question.
There are 280 members at the moment in over 50 countries, and these are some fantastic organizations. They range from groups that are really working within communities at the grassroots levels, working with community leaders, with religious leaders, with other community elders to really try and create a dialogue around what child marriage means for that community, what it does to the girls themselves, but what it does to the broader community. But our members are also, beyond doing this work of changing some of the social norms, they're also really trying to address that incredibly difficult question, which is, what's the alternative? Right? So many of our members are working on creating safe spaces for girls who may be trapped in a marriage but who want to get out, or who may be at risk of being married. Programs on education, programs on economic empowerment, building awareness among a wider community through incredibly innovative campaigns that use all kinds of different avenues. And they're also working with their governments, just like Girls Not Brides USA has been doing in the US. They're working with their own governments to make the case that it just makes sense to address child marriage if you want your girls, your citizens, and your communities to thrive. So some of the members have actually coalesced in a similar model at the national level to create national partnerships or national coalitions where they advocate for laws on the age of child marriage to be standardized and to be enforced, laws around birth registration, and also creating partnerships to really elevate this issue to some of the highest levels. And as both of you said, actually, there is change that's happening in a number of different ways. We actually just saw in April in Zambia that the First Lady of Zambia and the Minister of Chiefs and Traditional Affairs launched a national campaign against child marriage because it is a significant issue there. And that's something that they've been doing also in partnership with a number of non-governmental organizations. So it's really trying to address this problem, as has been mentioned before, in a holistic manner, both by creating change at the community level, creating alternatives for girls themselves and the parents and families in wider communities as to what else can they do, and changing the more structural elements around the legal frameworks, etc. I think we've actually gotten some questions from some of the online supporters who are watching. So
Great.
Maybe I can jump to one of those questions if you guys don't mind.
Great.
We actually let's see, Rachel. We got a question from Abigail Hunt on Twitter, who asks, how will U.S. foreign policy to end child marriage be delivered in a way that promotes community ownership of a U.S. objective? It's a really interesting question.
That's a great question. And, I think Jennifer alluded to that a little bit, and I can take up on her lead and continue to highlight places, for example, where we can work government to government because the government has already taken on this issue. And so I mentioned Ethiopia as a place where there already is a national action plan on harmful traditional practices that addresses child marriage. So the U.S. can work government to government with a country like that to amplify its efforts and its determination that this is a priority that government needs to work on. I think we can also support programs at the community level that engage with the community and community leaders. I think an excellent example of a program like that, which we profiled in the report, is an organization called Tostan. And Tostan works directly with communities to provide comprehensive community empowerment programs that address issues like child marriage, like female genital mutilation, and encourages participants to conduct outreach within their social networks. And since 1997, Tostan has worked with more than 5,000 Senegalese villages, and as recently as January of this year, another 425 villages, made public declarations against child marriage and FGM. So I think that the type of success that we've seen from organizations that are working on the ground directly with communities is those are the types of programs that the U.S. government could really foster and support to make sure that there is community ownership over ensuring the health, the well-being, and the potential of girls and thereby their families, communities, and economies around the world. Great question.
Thanks. Gosh, there's quite a few coming in. Here's another question. Maybe I'll ask Jen, if that's okay. We actually received a comment from Jason on Google+, who says, I agree that 12 years is too young, but 15 or 16 is actually not all that young. Just a century or so ago, European and American children were match-made at those ages. I still do not believe that the U.S. should meddle so much in other cultures. What do you think about that kind of statement?
Yeah, it's definitely something that we hear often coming from, I recognize that I'm a white middle-class woman, but I wish our colleagues and partners working in their own communities trying to end this practice could answer this question instead of me, because I think what they would say is the ability to decide if, when, and whom you marry is a universal right. And it should, regardless of where you live or where you were born. And so what we're trying to do is protect their ability to exercise that right. We aren't making decisions for them. We're in fact providing them opportunities to make choices on their own behalf. And unfortunately, for millions of women and girls around the world, that choice, among many others, simply isn't accessible to them. So the work of the International Women's Health Coalition, Girls Not Brides USA, Girls Not Brides Global, what we're trying to do is provide the opportunity for girls to have a choice and a chance and to make decisions about their own lives. And we're not necessarily talking about 16, 17-year-old girls who are marrying their high school sweethearts. We're talking about girls that are 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, that again come home one day and they're forced into a marriage to a man they've often never met. They leave school, they have very few prospects for the future. So what we're doing is trying to help implement international consensus agreements that exist all the way dating back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that talk about the ability to decide if, when, and whom you marry is a fundamental human right. So one of the most important aspects, though, is ask women and girls what they want. And I guarantee you, they will tell you they do not want to be forced into marriage at 13, 14, 15, 16, or any age. They want to be able to have that right. And so that's the work here, and that's the emphasis, is to ensure that every woman and girl, no matter where she's born or where she lives, can decide freely, with full and informed consent about who she chooses to marry.
Thanks, Jen. I actually see that there's another question here from the Girl Up Club of Indonesia.
Yay, Girl Up!
And they ask, what's the best way to counter religious teachings that justify child marriage practices? That's a really great question, Girl Up. It's interesting. Child marriage is a practice that occurs across religions, and there's often a perception that there's some religious obligation element to it. But, child marriage is actually not endorsed by any religion. And it's not necessarily something that people know. So it's difficult to change traditions, to change the way things have been done for many, many years. And that's why it's so important to make sure that any work on child marriage is rooted within communities and working with communities and community leaders on just going through the implications of child marriage and thinking about what are some of the reasons why this practice has been taking place and why it may not need to take place anymore. A number of our members actually spend a lot of time working on this. They spend a lot of time with religious leaders, with religious scholars, on just working through what religions actually say about child marriage. We have some really interesting work going on with some of our members in Pakistan who've who've actually been working with a number of madrasas, which are the schools for clerics, and working in a very respectful manner with the leaders of these schools on going through the curriculum and really making sure that people understand what it is that that some of these religions really do push for. So I think we don't have a huge amount of time left for this hangout. So maybe if I could actually ask the two of you, just really quickly within 30 seconds, what do you guys think that concerned Americans ought to be doing to bring an end to child marriage around the world?
Sure, Rachel, I'd be happy to take that question, and feel free to add on if you'd like. So there is absolutely no limit to what the U.S. constituents and Americans who are outraged and rightly outraged by this issue can do. The first thing is looking at what you can do within your own community. Are there op-eds you can write? Is your member of Congress available to speak with? Join the 50 Days of Action for Women and Girls campaign. Right now, it's the theme of the week is ending child marriage. Join your voice to the discussion, USA for Girls, USA for Women hashtags, and speak to Mr. Kerry and speak to the administration officials who are the key decision makers related to how robust of a strategy, how much dollars will go towards it, and tell them as an American, this is a priority for you. You believe that no matter where in the world a girl lives, she has the right to decide if, when, and whom she marries, and she has the right to not only just survive, but she has the right to thrive. And join the discussion, raise your voice, write a letter to Secretary Kerry and talk about why this matters to you, why it matters for the American people, that by having a just, secure, and stable world means a just, secure, stable, and prosperous America. And of course, the moral imperative aspect. It's an outrage that girls are being forced into what amounts to sexual slavery for the rest of their lives. That I have a 12-year-old daughter, and I don't want my 12-year-old daughter to be married off like that. So please do provide your experience, your thoughts, and join the 50 Days for Action campaign and really demonstrate the level of constituency support and American support out there for robust and strategic action on this issue.
And just to add on to Jen's answer, I think what the Council's new report on child marriage really does is pull together the volume of evidence and research that exists to show how this issue undermines our foreign policy objectives in the areas of global health, of economic growth, education, rule of law, and stability. These are critical issues to the U.S. and to our foreign policy and our national security. And so I think you can use that evidence. Take a look at the evidence, take a look at the report when you're thinking about how this issue matters and why it matters to you.
That's absolutely right. The report does indeed pull together so many of the strands that have been coming up on this issue. I think we're all out of time, so I'd like to really thank Jen and Rachel for this really interesting discussion. As Jen said, there's huge amounts of stuff that you can do if you're concerned about this issue, if you're interested in this issue. You can educate yourself by reading the report, by joining the campaign, by also looking at Girls Not Brides. As I said, there are members all over the world who are doing really, really interesting and life-changing work for a number of the girls who are out there who are getting married. So thank you very much. And let's hope the U.S. government takes into account some of these fantastic recommendations and that we can be proud of how U.S. foreign policy will be addressing child marriage.
Absolutely. Girls cannot and should not have to wait any